scream came before the music stopped. Margaret Ellison felt hands close around her wrist and pull her through a heavy curtain into a darkened side room, and before she could ask what was happening, the curtain fell shut behind her and a man's voice, low and startled, spoke into the silence. "Who are you?" She spun around and found herself facing a tall figure in a black coat, his cravat loosened, his expression somewhere between confusion and alarm. She recognized him at once. Everyone in London recognized him. Alaric Vane, Duke of Ashworth, stood before her with the look of a man who had just realized he was standing far too close to a woman he had never met. "I could ask you the same question," Margaret said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. Before either of them could explain themselves, the curtain was thrown open again, and a crowd of guests stood staring into the small room, candlelight catching on shocked faces and raised eyebrows. Somewhere among them, a woman gasped loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "The Duke of Ashworth," someone whispered, alone with Miss Ellison, behind a closed curtain. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She had come to this ball as a companion to her aunt, nothing more, hoping to pass an unremarkable evening in a corner with a cup of punch. She had not planned to be dragged into a private alcove with the most talked-about man in England. She tried to step forward, to explain, but the crowd had already begun to murmur, and murmurs at a ball spread faster than fire through dry grass. "I did not touch her," Alaric said sharply, but his voice was lost beneath the rising tide of whispers. Margaret searched the crowd and found the one face that did not look surprised at all. Lady Cordelia Whitmore stood near the doorway, a small, satisfied smile curling at the corner of her mouth before she quickly rearranged her features into practiced shock. It was only a flicker, but Margaret saw it, and something cold settled in her stomach. This had not been an accident. "Someone pulled me in here," Margaret said, louder this time, trying to make herself heard. "I did not choose to come." But it was too late. The story was already forming in the minds of everyone watching, and the truth had little power against a room full of people eager for scandal. A gentleman near the punch table repeated the tale to his companion with obvious delight, adding details that had never happened at all, and within minutes those details were being repeated further still, growing larger and stranger with every retelling. By the time Margaret's aunt pushed through the crowd to reach her, pale and horrified, the damage was already done. Whispers had become declarations. A private mistake had become public ruin. Margaret felt every eye in the room settle on her at once, a weight she had never experienced before and hoped never to experience again. She had spent her whole life being the quiet, overlooked daughter of a respectable but unremarkable family, comfortable in her invisibility. Now, in the space of a few minutes, she had become the single most discussed woman in London, and not for any reason she would have chosen. "We must leave," her aunt said, gripping Margaret's arm. "Now." Margaret did not argue. She kept her eyes forward as they moved through the ballroom, ignoring the stares, the fans lifted to hide smirking mouths, the low laughter that followed her like a shadow. She had done nothing wrong, and yet by morning, all of London would believe otherwise. The carriage ride home was silent except for her aunt's occasional sharp intake of breath, as though she could not quite believe what had happened. Margaret stared out the window at the passing streets, her mind replaying the moment again and again, the hand on her wrist, the curtain falling, the Duke's startled face, and Cordelia's smile, quick and cruel and gone before anyone else could see it. She did not sleep that night. By dawn, a letter had already arrived at her family's modest townhouse, delivered by a servant in fine livery, sealed with a wax crest she did not recognize but somehow already knew. Her brother Edmund found her in the sitting room, the letter unopened in her lap. "What is it?" he asked, dropping into the chair across from her, his own face still tight with anger from the night before. Edmund had wanted to challenge someone, anyone, for what had happened to his sister, but there had been no one clear target for his fury, only whispers and a Duke who claimed innocence. "I don't know," Margaret said. "I haven't opened it." "Then let me." She handed it over, watching his face as he broke the seal and read. His jaw tightened with each line, and when he finished, he set the letter down slowly, as though it might explode if handled carelessly. "It's from the Duke," he said. "He wishes to call on you this afternoon." Margaret's stomach turned. Whatever for? But she already suspected the answer, and when Edmund said nothing, only looked at her with a mixture of pity and worry, she knew she was right. The Duke of Ashworth arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, dressed in a dark coat that made him look even taller and more severe than he had the night before. He was shown into the sitting room, where Margaret sat stiffly beside her aunt, Edmund standing near the window with his arms crossed. Alaric did not sit. He stood near the door, as though he might need to leave quickly, and came directly to the point in a voice that betrayed no emotion at all. "By now you understand the position we are both in," he said. "By tonight, every drawing room in London will be discussing what happened at the Ashcombe ball. Your reputation, Miss Ellison, has been damaged beyond repair by ordinary means. There is only one way to correct it." Margaret's aunt made a small sound of distress, but Margaret herself felt strangely calm, as though she were watching the scene from somewhere outside her own body. "You wish to marry me," she said, "to protect your own name." "I wish," Alaric said, "to prevent further harm, to you and to my family. A marriage would silence the scandal entirely. There would be nothing left to whisper about." "And what of what I wish?" Margaret asked. For a moment something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, as though no one had asked him that question in a very long time. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the same controlled calm. "I understand this is not the marriage either of us imagined," he said. "But I assure you, you would want for nothing. My estate, my protection, my name, all of it would be yours." "Everything except your trust," Margaret said quietly, "since you clearly believe I orchestrated this myself." "I did not say that." "You did not need to." Edmund stepped forward then, his voice sharp. "My sister did nothing wrong. She was pulled into that room against her will. If you intend to marry her only to save your own reputation, you might at least have the decency to admit it plainly." Alaric's eyes moved to Edmund, then back to Margaret, and for the first time something like genuine consideration crossed his face. "You are right," he said. "I do not know who arranged what happened last night, but I intend to find out. Until then, marriage is the only path that protects your sister from ruin." Margaret looked at her aunt, whose face had gone pale with worry, and then at Edmund, whose anger had not faded but had shifted into something more like helpless frustration. She understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that there was no other choice. A woman without a fortune, without powerful connections, could not survive the kind of scandal that had attached itself to her name overnight. Marriage to the Duke would end it. Refusal would only confirm every ugly rumor already spreading through the city. "Very well," she said, surprising even herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I accept." Something passed over Alaric's face, relief perhaps, though it was gone before she could be certain. He inclined his head, formal and correct. "Thank you," he said. "I will make the arrangements. The ceremony will be quiet and quick, before the gossip has time to grow any larger." After he left, Margaret sat very still in the empty sitting room, her aunt already retreating upstairs to compose herself, Edmund pacing near the window with his hands clenched at his sides. "You do not have to do this," he said finally. "We could leave London, go to the countryside, wait until it passes." "It will not pass," Margaret said. "Not for me. A man's reputation survives scandal. A woman's does not." She thought of Cordelia's smile again, quick and satisfied, gone in an instant but seared into her memory all the same. Someone had planned this. Someone had chosen her, specifically, to be pulled into that room at exactly the right moment for the crowd to see. She did not yet understand why, but she intended to find out, and marrying the Duke, whatever else it meant, would at least place her close enough to uncover the truth. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not fear exactly, though there was fear in it. Something closer to determination. She had not chosen this marriage, had not asked for any of it, but she would not enter it as a victim of someone else's scheme. She thought of the Duke's face when he had asked what she wished, the brief flicker of surprise before it disappeared behind his careful control. There was something guarded in him, something that ran deeper than simple pride or reputation. Whatever had made him so quick to assume the worst of her, so practiced at hiding his true feelings, had happened long before last night's scandal. Margaret did not know, yet, whether she would ever understand the man she was about to marry, but as she extinguished her candle and lay in the darkness, she found herself thinking not of the whispers, not of Cordelia's satisfied smile, but of that single unguarded moment in his eyes. Tomorrow, the announcement would appear in the papers, and London would have a new story to tell, one of duty and rescue and a hasty wedding to save a lady's honor. No one would print the truth of the curtain, the hand on her wrist, the smile she alone had noticed. No one would ask who had planned it, or why, or what it meant that a woman like Cordelia Whitmore had been standing so close to the alcove at exactly the right moment. Margaret intended to ask those questions herself, quietly, patiently, for as long as it took to find the answers. She was not a woman who forgot a slight, and she was certainly not a woman who would spend her marriage believing herself guilty of something she had never done. Whatever waited for her at Ashworth, she intended to face it with her eyes open. The wedding took place on a gray morning, in a small chapel with only a handful of witnesses, exactly as Alaric had promised. There were no flowers arranged in careful bouquets, no crowd of well-wishers spilling out onto the steps, only the quiet exchange of vows between two people who barely knew each other's faces, let alone their hearts. Margaret wore a simple gray dress that her aunt had altered overnight, and when Alaric slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady and his expression unreadable. She searched his face for some sign of what he felt, relief, regret, anything at all, but found only the same careful composure he had worn since the night of the ball. By afternoon, she was riding beside him in a carriage bound for Ashworth, his country estate, leaving behind the only home and family she had ever known. The house itself was magnificent, stone and ivy and tall windows catching the fading light, but Margaret felt no comfort in its grandeur. She felt instead like a guest who had wandered into someone else's life and been told to stay. "Mrs. Fenwick will show you to your rooms," Alaric said as they stepped through the entrance hall, gesturing to a stern-faced housekeeper who appeared almost instantly, as though she had been waiting behind the door. "If you require anything, she will see to it." "Thank you," Margaret said, though the words felt strange in her mouth, formal and distant, the same tone one might use with a stranger rather than a husband. He did not offer to show her the house himself. He did not ask if she was tired from the journey, or hungry, or frightened to be standing in a home so much larger and colder than anything she had known. He simply turned and disappeared down a corridor, leaving her alone with a housekeeper who studied her with open suspicion. "This way, Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said, and though the title was correct, the tone carried none of the respect it should have. That first night, Margaret lay awake in a bedroom far grander than any she had ever slept in, staring at unfamiliar shadows on the ceiling, and listening to the unfamiliar creaks of a house that did not yet feel like hers. Somewhere down the corridor she could hear the faint murmur of Alaric's voice speaking with his valet, low and businesslike, nothing in it that suggested a man who had married only hours before. She wondered if he lay awake too, or if sleep came easily to a man who had simply solved a problem in the most efficient way available to him. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Margaret rose early, ate her meals largely alone, and spent long hours exploring the vast house or sitting in the library, trying to make sense of her new life. The house had wings she had not yet fully explored, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the halls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with quiet judgment as she passed. She often wondered what they would think of her, this quiet, unremarkable woman who had become duchess through scandal rather than courtship. Alaric was rarely present. He spent his days in meetings with his steward, his solicitors, his tenants, disappearing into his study each evening and rarely emerging before Margaret had already retired for the night. She learned the sound of his study door closing the way one learns the sound of distant thunder, a signal that the evening had ended and she would not see him again until morning. She told herself she did not mind the solitude. She had, after all, spent much of her life in quiet corners, overlooked and unremarkable. But there was a difference between choosing invisibility and having it imposed upon her by a husband who seemed to regard her as an obligation rather than a wife. The servants, too, kept their distance, taking their cues from Mrs. Fenwick's cool civility. Margaret often caught them exchanging glances when they thought she was not looking, whispers that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She understood, without needing to be told, exactly what story they believed. That she had trapped the Duke deliberately, engineered the scandal herself to secure a title and fortune she had not earned. It was a younger housemaid, barely older than a girl, who first let the cruelty slip into words rather than glances. Margaret had asked for a fire to be lit in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own, and the girl had muttered, just loud enough to be heard, that some women worked harder to trap a duke than others worked for an honest living. Margaret said nothing in response, though the words stayed with her long after the girl had gone. She was still sitting by the newly lit fire, staring into the flames, when she heard footsteps in the doorway, and looked up to find Alaric standing there, an expression on his face she had not seen before. "Which girl said that to you?" he asked, his voice quiet, but edged with something sharp. Margaret blinked, surprised he had heard, surprised even more that he seemed to care. "It does not matter. It matters to me." He stepped further into the room. "No one in this house will speak to you with disrespect. You are the Duchess of Ashworth. Whatever anyone believes about how that came to be, they will treat you accordingly, or they will find employment elsewhere." "You do not need to defend me," Margaret said, though something in his sudden firmness had loosened a knot in her chest she had not realized was there. I am accustomed to being spoken of unkindly. You should not have to be accustomed to it, Alaric said. Not in my house. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, and Margaret sat for a long while afterward, turning the moment over in her mind. It was such a small thing, a few words spoken in her defense, and yet it was the first genuine warmth she had felt from him since the night of the ball. The following morning, the young housemaid did not appear at breakfast, and Mrs. Fenwick's manner toward Margaret grew noticeably more careful, though no less distant. Margaret did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. Word had clearly traveled through the household overnight, carried from the kitchens to the stables to every corner of the estate, that the new Duchess was not a woman to be spoken of carelessly, whatever the servants privately believed about how she had come to hold the title. It should have satisfied her, this small victory, this proof that her husband would not allow her to be mistreated under his own roof, and yet Margaret found herself troubled by how little comfort it actually brought. She did not want silence born of fear. She wanted, though she could hardly admit it even to herself, something closer to genuine respect, the kind that could not be commanded by a duke's sharp words but had to be earned, slowly, through her own actions. She began, in small ways, to try. She learned the names of the servants who had once avoided her gaze, asked after a scullery maid's ailing mother, remembered which footman preferred to be addressed formally, and which one relaxed at the smallest kindness. It was slow work, and she suspected some of the staff would never fully warm to her, but gradually, she noticed fewer whispered conversations that stopped abruptly at her approach, fewer sideways glances exchanged behind her back. Still, the distance between herself and her husband remained. Dinners were formal and largely silent, conversation limited to polite questions about the weather or the state of the roads. Margaret found herself studying him across the table, searching for some crack in his composure, some sign of the man who had spoken so sharply in her defense. She found small clues, scattered and easy to miss, the way he always ensured she was seated nearest the fire, the way he had, without comment, arranged for a selection of books to be delivered to the library, several of which touched on subjects she had once mentioned in passing and assumed he had forgotten. The way his shoulders tightened whenever a servant mentioned Cordelia Whitmore's name, though he never explained why. One evening, several weeks into their marriage, Margaret found herself walking the gardens alone as the sun began to set, the air cool and fragrant with late summer roses. She did not expect to find Alaric there, seated on a stone bench near the fountain, a letter open in his hands and an expression of quiet frustration on his face. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I did not mean to intrude," Margaret said, turning to leave. "You are not intruding," he said. "This is your garden as much as mine." She hesitated, then sat, carefully, at the far end of the bench. The silence between them was less uncomfortable than it had been at dinner, softened by the quiet sound of water in the fountain and the fading light overhead. "Is something troubling you?" she asked finally, nodding toward the letter still held loosely in his hand. "A matter of business," he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested it was more than that. "Nothing you need concern yourself with." "You seem to believe I need protecting from every unpleasant thing in this house," Margaret said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I am not made of glass, Your Grace." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Margaret felt a small, unexpected warmth in her chest. "No," he said slowly, "I do not suppose you are. You mentioned once, at dinner, that you enjoyed the poetry of the old masters," Alaric said suddenly, as though the words had been waiting behind his teeth for some time. "I did not forget. The books in the library were not chosen at random." Margaret felt a warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "I wondered," she admitted. "I did not think you paid such close attention to what I said." "I pay attention to more than you realize," he said, then seemed almost startled by his own admission, straightening slightly on the bench as though he had revealed more than he intended. "Then perhaps you might pay attention to this," Margaret said, gathering her courage. "I do not wish to spend the whole of our marriage speaking to you only of weather and roads. If we are to share a life, however it began, I would rather know the man I am sharing it with." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, watching the water ripple in the fountain. "There is not a great deal to know," he said finally, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I run this estate. I attend to my duties. I have little patience for society, and even less trust in it." "Something taught you that distrust," Margaret said gently. "I do not think a man is born believing the worst of people." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought she had pushed too far, that he would rise and retreat into the house as he so often did. But he remained seated, his eyes still fixed on the fountain. Perhaps another evening, he said quietly. I will tell you. It was not the answer Margaret had hoped for, but it was not a refusal either, and she found she could be patient with the promise of another evening, another conversation, another small step closer to the truth of him. He did not share the contents of the letter, not that evening, but something in the exchange had shifted between them, a small crack in the wall he had built so carefully since the day they married. Margaret found herself thinking of it long after she had returned to her room, turning the moment over like a smooth stone in her palm. She still did not know this man, not truly. She did not know what had made him so guarded, so quick to retreat behind formality and distance. But she had begun to suspect that the coldness was not simply indifference, it was armor, carefully built and carefully maintained, and she found herself wondering, for the first time since the night of the scandal, what might lie beneath it if she were ever allowed to see. As autumn crept over the estate and the gardens began to fade toward winter, Margaret continued her quiet observations, gathering small pieces of a man who revealed himself only in fragments. She did not yet trust him. She was not certain she ever fully would, not after the manner of their marriage. But she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer dreaded the long silent evenings quite as much as she once had. She thought often of Cordelia Whitmore during those quiet weeks, the satisfied smile that had flickered across her face in the ballroom before vanishing behind practiced shock. Margaret had said nothing of her suspicions to Alaric. Not yet. She did not have proof, only instinct, and instinct alone would not be enough to convince a man who had already been made a fool once by someone he trusted. But she watched, and she waited, certain that a woman capable of such careful cruelty would not simply disappear from their lives. Cordelia would return, in some form, and when she did, Margaret intended to be ready. For now, though, she allowed herself the small, fragile comfort of a marriage that seemed, slowly, to be thawing. A shared glance across the dinner table that lingered a moment longer than necessary. A rare, unguarded laugh from Alaric when one of the estate dogs knocked over a vase in the front hall. A quiet walk through the gardens that no longer felt like an intrusion but an invitation. Something was changing between them, slow and uncertain, like the first thaw before spring. Margaret did not know where it would lead, but for the first time since the night of the scandal, she found herself curious to find out. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in handwriting so elegant and familiar that Margaret felt her stomach tighten before she had even broken the seal. Lady Cordelia Whitmore wished to call upon her. Margaret read the words twice, then set the letter aside on her writing desk, her fingers lingering on the paper as though she might discover some hidden truth beneath the ink. She had known this moment would come eventually. A woman who had engineered a scandal so carefully would not simply vanish from the story she had written. She considered refusing the visit outright, but curiosity, and a growing determination to understand exactly what had happened that night at the ball, won out over caution. If Cordelia wished to play the role of a friendly acquaintance, Margaret would allow her that role, if only to study her more closely and search for the cracks beneath the performance. She sent her reply within the hour, inviting Cordelia to tea the following afternoon. She spent that night rehearsing questions in her mind, careful phrasings that might catch Cordelia off guard, without revealing too much of her own suspicions. She had never been a woman skilled in the games of society, the careful maneuvering and hidden meanings that seemed to come so naturally to women like Cordelia, but she was determined to learn quickly. Too much depended on it, not only her own peace of mind but whatever fragile trust was beginning to grow between herself and Alaric. When she mentioned the visit to Alaric that evening at dinner, his fork paused halfway to his mouth, and something guarded passed behind his eyes. "Lady Whitmore," he repeated, setting the fork down slowly. "Why would she wish to call on you?" "I do not know," Margaret said, watching him carefully. "Perhaps she wishes to offer her congratulations on our marriage." "Cordelia does not do anything without purpose," Alaric said, and the sharpness in his voice told Margaret more than his words did. Whatever history existed between her husband and Cordelia Whitmore, it had left a mark deep enough that even the mention of her name changed the air in the room. "You knew her well," Margaret said carefully. It was not quite a question. Alaric's jaw tightened. "Once, before I understood what she was." He did not elaborate further, and Margaret did not press, though she filed the moment away carefully. Another small piece of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. She understood now, with growing certainty, that the woman who had smiled so satisfied in the ballroom shadows had not simply been an opportunist seizing a chance encounter. She had history with Alaric, and history, Margaret suspected, was exactly what had shaped him into the guarded, distrustful man she had married. Cordelia arrived precisely on time the following afternoon, dressed in pale blue silk that made her look every bit as innocent and delicate as she clearly intended. She swept into the sitting room with a warm smile and outstretched hands, as though greeting an old friend rather than a woman she had likely ruined for her own purposes. "Margaret, my dear, how wonderful you look," Cordelia said, settling gracefully onto the settee across from her. "Married life clearly agrees with you." "How kind of you to say," Margaret replied, keeping her voice pleasant and even, though every instinct urged caution. "I confess I was surprised to receive your letter." "Were you?" Cordelia's eyes widened with practiced innocence. "I only wish to offer my congratulations properly, and perhaps clear the air between us. I know the circumstances of your marriage were rather unusual." "Unusual is one word for it," Margaret said. Cordelia laughed softly, a musical sound that carried no real warmth. "You must understand, Margaret, London society can be terribly cruel to those it does not know well. I merely wish to offer my friendship should you find yourself in need of guidance in your new position." Margaret poured the tea with steady hands, though her mind raced beneath the calm surface. Everything about Cordelia's visit felt calculated, from the careful sympathy in her voice to the way her gaze occasionally drifted toward the corridor, as though watching for someone. "Tell me," Margaret said, deciding boldness might serve her better than caution. "Were you at the ball that evening? The night of the scandal?" Something flickered across Cordelia's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Margaret had spent weeks learning to notice such fleeting expressions in her own husband, and she recognized the same careful control in Cordelia now. "I believe I was," Cordelia said lightly. "Though I confess I did not see exactly what happened. Such a shame, the way rumors spread so quickly at these events." "A shame indeed," Margaret agreed, watching her closely. "Though I have always wondered how such a private moment came to be witnessed by so many people, all at once, as though the crowd had gathered specifically to see it." Cordelia's smile did not waver, but her grip on her teacup tightened almost imperceptibly. "I could not say. These things simply happen, I suppose." "I suppose they do," Margaret said, and let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable, watching Cordelia's composure hold, though barely. "You must miss London terribly," Cordelia continued, setting her teacup down with a delicate clink. "The country can be so dreadfully quiet for a young bride, especially one married under such sudden circumstances. Do you not find yourself lonely here, with the Duke so often occupied with his affairs?" "I find the quiet suits me," Margaret said evenly, though she recognized the probing beneath the pleasant words. Cordelia was testing the boundaries of her marriage, searching for weaknesses she might later exploit. "My husband and I are growing to understand one another well enough." "How fortunate," Cordelia said, though something tight had entered her voice. "Alaric was always difficult to understand, even for those of us who knew him well in his younger years. I do hope you find him easier to read than I once did." "Perhaps I simply have more patience," Margaret said, holding Cordelia's gaze steadily. The remark landed exactly as Margaret intended, a small flicker of something sharp crossing Cordelia's features before she smoothed it away behind another practiced smile. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, proof that beneath the elegant composure lay old wounds Cordelia had never fully healed. The conversation moved to safer topics after that: fashion, the weather, upcoming events in London society, but Margaret's suspicions had only hardened. She was now certain, with the kind of quiet conviction that did not need proof to feel true, that Cordelia Whitmore had orchestrated the entire scandal, and that her visit today had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with assessing how much Margaret knew, or suspected. After Cordelia finally departed, trailing perfume and false warmth behind her, Margaret sat alone in the quiet sitting room, turning the conversation over in her mind. She would need proof before she could accuse anyone of anything, and proof would not come easily from a woman so skilled at hiding her intentions behind pleasant smiles. She found Alaric in his study that evening, later than usual, staring at a ledger without truly reading it. He looked up when she entered, surprise briefly crossing his features. She rarely sought him out in his own domain. "How was your visit?" he asked, setting down his pen. "Enlightening," Margaret said, taking a seat across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "I believe Lady Whitmore was present the night of our scandal. I believe, in fact, that she arranged for it to happen." Alaric went very still. "That is a serious accusation." "I have no proof yet," Margaret admitted. "Only instinct, and a woman's ability to recognize when another woman is lying to her face." She paused, watching him carefully. "You said you knew her once. Before you understood what she was. I would like to understand what you meant by that." For a long moment, Alaric said nothing, and Margaret thought he might refuse to answer, retreat behind the same careful walls he always did when the conversation ventured too close to something personal. But then he set down his pen entirely and leaned back in his chair, his expression tired in a way she had not seen before. "Cordelia and I were once close," he said, "before my father died, before I inherited the title. I believed, foolishly, that she cared for me as more than a means to a title and fortune. When it became clear that was not the case, when I discovered she had been courting another man's attention alongside mine, purely to see which offer would prove more advantageous, I ended the connection entirely." "She has held a grudge ever since," Margaret said slowly, pieces beginning to fall into place. "It would seem so," Alaric said, "though I confess I did not think her capable of something so calculated as what happened at the ball. I assumed, wrongly it seems, that time had softened whatever resentment remained." "She does not strike me as a woman who softens," Margaret said. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, brief but genuine. "No, I do not suppose she does." The conversation lingered longer than either of them perhaps intended, moving from Cordelia to other matters entirely. Small details of Alaric's childhood, his relationship with his late father, the weight of responsibility that had settled on him far too young when he inherited the dukedom. Margaret listened, careful not to interrupt, sensing that he rarely spoke so openly, and that the moment was fragile enough to shatter with the wrong word. "Why did you never tell anyone the truth of what happened between you?" Margaret asked gently. "Why let London believe you simply lost interest in her, rather than admit she had deceived you?" Alaric was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the flickering candle between them. "Pride, I suppose. And perhaps a foolish hope that if I said nothing, the humiliation would fade faster. Instead, I simply became known as a man too cold and too particular to settle on any woman, which suited me well enough, until the night of our own scandal forced my hand entirely." "I am sorry," Margaret said softly, "that she made you doubt yourself so thoroughly." "You need not apologize for her cruelty," Alaric said, though something in his voice had softened considerably since the conversation began. "You have done nothing but prove, again and again, that you are nothing like her." The words settled warmly in Margaret's chest, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable rather than strained, filled only with the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. It was well past midnight when Margaret finally returned to her own room, her mind full of new understanding. She had married a man shaped by betrayal, guarded so carefully against being fooled again that he had built walls around himself thick enough to keep out even genuine affection. And she had likely married into the middle of an old wound that Cordelia Whitmore was determined to reopen. The proof of Cordelia's involvement came sooner than Margaret expected, though not in the way she anticipated. 3 days later, a crisis struck the estate. A fire broke out in one of the tenant cottages on the eastern edge of the property, the flames visible from the main house as smoke rose black against the gray afternoon sky. Alaric was away in the village, meeting with his solicitor, and it was Margaret who first heard the shouting from the stables and understood, with a cold jolt of alarm, what was happening. She did not hesitate. She gathered every servant she could find, organized a line to carry water from the nearest well, and rode out herself toward the burning cottage, her heart pounding but her mind clear and focused. The Tennant family, a mother and 3 young children, stood outside the cottage in shock, the youngest child crying and pointing toward the flames still visible through a window. "The cat," the child sobbed. "She's still inside." Without pausing to think, Margaret handed her horse's reins to a stable boy and moved toward the cottage, ignoring the shouts of alarm behind her. Smoke stung her eyes and throat as she pushed through the door, low to the ground where the air remained clearer, calling out for the animal in a voice made steady by sheer determination. She found the cat cowering beneath an overturned table near the back of the small kitchen, and scooped it into her arms just as a beam somewhere above cracked loudly, sending a shower of sparks down through the smoke. She turned and ran, coughing, her eyes streaming, and stumbled out through the door just as several of the estate's men arrived with buckets and began fighting the flames in earnest. Alaric returned from the village less than an hour later to find the fire largely contained, the Tennant family safe, and his wife sitting on the grass outside the cottage, soot streaked across her face, a rescued cat curled protectively in her lap while a small child sat pressed against her side. He dismounted so quickly he nearly stumbled, crossing the distance between them in long, urgent strides. "Margaret," his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I am fine," she said, though her voice was rough from smoke. "The fire started in the kitchen, we believe from an overturned lamp. Everyone is safe." He knelt beside her, his eyes moving over her face, her hands, as though checking for injury he could not quite believe she had escaped. You went inside, he said, into a burning building. There was a cat, Margaret said, as though that explained everything, and perhaps, in her mind, it did. Something shifted in Alaric's expression then, something Margaret had never seen from him before, not even in their quietest, most honest conversations. It was not simply relief. It was something closer to awe, and beneath it, a dawning respect that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. You did not have to do that, he said quietly. No, Margaret agreed. But I could not simply stand by and do nothing. He reached out, hesitant, and brushed a streak of soot from her cheek with careful fingers, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary. You are remarkable, he said, so quietly she almost did not hear it. Margaret felt her breath catch, something warm unfurling in her chest that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the fire. I am simply someone who does not enjoy watching others suffer when I have the power to help, she said. That is rarer than you realize, Alaric said. He helped her to her feet, and together they oversaw the final efforts to secure the cottage and comfort the shaken family, working side by side in a way they had not before. A quiet partnership that felt entirely different from the cold formality of their earlier weeks together. Margaret found blankets for the children, arranged for the family to stay in one of the empty cottages near the main house until repairs could be made, and listened patiently as the mother wept with relief and gratitude, clutching Margaret's hands as though she could not quite believe a duchess had run into a burning building for the sake of her children's cat. Alaric, for his part, promised the family that every repair would be made swiftly and at his own expense, his voice carrying none of its usual careful distance, only genuine concern. Margaret watched him move among the tenants, speaking with each of them in turn, and understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of responsibility he carried so quietly beneath his composed exterior. He was not simply a cold, guarded duke. He was a man who cared deeply for those under his protection, even if he rarely allowed that care to show. By the time they finally returned to the main house, the sun setting behind them in streaks of orange and gold, something had changed between them, subtle but undeniable. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Alaric did not retreat to his study after dinner. Instead, he remained in the sitting room with Margaret, the two of them talking quietly by the fire long after the servants had retired for the night. And when Margaret finally rose to seek her own bed, she carried with her a feeling she had not expected to find in this marriage born of scandal and obligation. Something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of trust. Autumn deepened into its fullest colors, the estate gardens turning gold and copper beneath skies that grew grayer with each passing week. And with the changing season came a quiet, steady shift in the marriage that had begun so coldly months before. Alaric no longer retreated to his study every evening. More often than not, Margaret found him waiting for her in the small sitting room after dinner, a book in hand or simply staring into the fire, and he would look up when she entered with an expression that had softened considerably since the early weeks of their marriage. Their conversations grew longer, easier, filled with small confidences neither of them had expected to share. The household, too, had begun to notice the change. Mrs. Fenwick's cool civility had warmed into something closer to genuine regard, and the servants no longer exchanged wary glances when Margaret passed through the corridors. Word had spread through the estate of her courage during the fire, and with it had come a quiet respect that no amount of formal correction from Alaric could ever have commanded. Margaret found herself, for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth, beginning to feel that the great stone house might one day truly feel like home. Even the portraits lining the long gallery seemed less imposing than they once had, their painted eyes no longer following her with silent judgment, but with something closer to quiet acceptance. Or perhaps that was only her own imagination, shaped by the growing warmth she felt within these walls. She had begun, without quite realizing it, to think of Ashworth not as a place she had been sent to endure, but as a home she was slowly, carefully building for herself. It was on one such evening, the rain tapping gently against the windows and a fire crackling warmly in the hearth, that Alaric finally spoke of the past he had kept so carefully guarded. Her name was Isabel, he said, without preamble, staring into the flames rather than at Margaret. We were engaged, briefly, before my father died. I believed, entirely and foolishly, that she loved me. Margaret set down the book she had been pretending to read and gave him her full attention, sensing the importance of the moment, the rare vulnerability in his voice. She did not? Margaret asked gently. She loved the idea of what I would become, Alaric said. The title, the fortune, the position in society. I discovered, only weeks before our wedding, that she had been quietly courting the attention of another suitor, one with a larger fortune and a more established name, keeping her options open, until she could determine which offer served her best. His jaw tightened at the memory. I ended the engagement immediately, but not before the humiliation had already spread through every drawing room in London. And Cordelia, Margaret said slowly, pieces finally settling into place, was Isabel's closest friend. Alaric's eyes met hers, surprised. How did you know that? I did not, until this moment, Margaret admitted, but it explains a great deal. Her resentment toward you did not come from rejection alone. It came from watching a friend's schemes exposed, and perhaps some hand in the scheme herself, that never quite came to light. Perhaps, Alaric said. I never proved anything against Cordelia directly, though I always suspected she played some part in encouraging Isabel's ambitions. It hardly mattered in the end. I simply closed myself off from society's schemes entirely, certain I would never again allow myself to be so thoroughly deceived. And then a scandal forced you into marriage regardless, Margaret said softly. Yes. He finally looked at her fully, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had rarely glimpsed before. I confess, in the beginning, I assumed you no different than Isabel. I assumed you had somehow orchestrated the entire situation, or at the very least, welcomed the opportunity it presented. Margaret felt a small ache at the admission, though she was not entirely surprised by it. And now? Now, Alaric said, his voice quiet but certain. I understand I was wrong. Thoroughly and completely wrong. You have shown me nothing but honesty since the moment we married, even when honesty was difficult, even when it would have been easier to simply play along with whatever role I expected of you. The words settled warmly in Margaret's chest, and she found herself reaching across the small distance between their chairs, resting her hand gently over his. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, tentative at first, then firmer, as though he were testing the solidity of the moment and finding it real. Thank you, Margaret said softly, for trusting me with this. You have earned far more than my trust, Alaric said, and something in his tone made her breath catch, a warmth in his voice she had never heard directed at her before. They sat together for a long while after that, hands still joined, speaking of smaller things, Margaret's own childhood, her love of poetry and quiet gardens, Alaric's memories of his father before illness had taken him, the weight of inheriting a dukedom at an age when most young men were still finding their place in the world. My father used to walk these gardens every evening, Alaric said, his voice softer than Margaret had ever heard it. Even in his final months, when illness had taken most of his strength, he insisted on it. He said a man who could not walk his own land had already surrendered more than his health. He sounds as though he was a man of great determination, Margaret said. He was, Alaric said. I have often wondered, since his passing, whether I have honored his memory as well as I ought, whether the man he raised me to become is the man I have actually become, or merely a colder imitation, hardened by circumstances he never had to face himself. I think, Margaret said carefully, that a man who runs into danger to protect his tenants, who defends his wife against unkind servants, who admits his past mistakes rather than hiding behind pride, has honored his father's memory well enough. Alaric looked at her then with an expression she had never seen from him before, something almost vulnerable in the set of his features, as though her words had reached somewhere deep and long neglected within him. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing me as I hope to be, rather than only as I have allowed myself to become. It was, Margaret realized as she finally rose to retire for the night, the most honest and complete conversation she had ever shared with another person. In the days that followed, small moments of genuine affection began to accumulate between them, quiet, but unmistakable. Alaric began joining her on her morning walks through the gardens, matching his pace to hers without seeming to notice he had done it. He began, too, to seek her opinion on matters of the estate, small decisions regarding the tenants or the household that he had once handled entirely alone. You have a clearer sense of people than I do, he admitted one afternoon, when Margaret suggested a gentler approach to a tenant family struggling to pay their rent after a difficult harvest. I am accustomed to managing numbers and ledgers. You seem to understand the people behind them. Perhaps because I have spent most of my life watching people from the edges of rooms, rather than commanding attention within them, Margaret said. It teaches you to notice things others overlook. Alaric studied her for a long moment, something like wonder in his expression. I am fortunate, he said quietly. That scandal brought me a wife I would never have thought to seek out myself, and yet cannot now imagine my life without. It was the closest he had come to a true declaration, and Margaret felt her heart lift with a happiness she had not expected to find in a marriage that had begun so coldly. She allowed herself, for the first time since the night of the ball, to imagine a future with this man that extended beyond mere obligation and survival, a future built on genuine partnership and, perhaps, something even deeper still. One crisp morning, Alaric surprised her by requesting her presence at a meeting with his steward, a request that startled the older man nearly as much as it startled Margaret herself. The steward had prepared a lengthy report on the estate's finances, dense with figures and projections that Margaret struggled at first to follow. But as the discussion turned to the well-being of the tenants rather than mere columns of numbers, she found her voice, offering observations about specific families she had come to know during her visits through the estate. "The Hargrove family has struggled since the fire took their storage shed," she said. "Perhaps a portion of this quarter's surplus might go toward rebuilding it, rather than sitting unused until spring." The steward glanced uncertainly at Alaric, clearly unaccustomed to a duchess offering opinions on estate matters, but Alaric only nodded, a faint smile touching his mouth. "See that it is done," he said, and the matter was settled as simply as that. Afterward, walking together back toward the house, Alaric glanced at her with something like admiration. "You handled that far better than I expected," he said. "Most gently bred young women would have found the discussion dull beyond enduring." "I do not find people dull," Margaret said. "Only numbers without faces attached to them." He laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Margaret felt the sound settle somewhere deep in her chest, a small treasure she intended to carry with her always. But even as their bond grew stronger, a quiet unease continued to linger at the edges of Margaret's happiness. She had not forgotten Cordelia's visit, the careful probing questions, the flicker of resentment she had glimpsed beneath the woman's practiced composure. She mentioned her lingering suspicions to Alaric one evening, watching his expression carefully as she spoke. "I do not believe Cordelia has finished with us," Margaret said. "A woman capable of orchestrating a public scandal, capable of holding a grudge for years over a broken engagement, does not simply retreat because her first scheme failed to achieve whatever she intended." "What do you believe she intended?" Alaric asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "I am not entirely certain," Margaret admitted. "Perhaps she hoped the scandal would ruin me entirely, leaving you unmarried and available once again for her own pursuit. Perhaps she simply wished to see you humiliated, as she believes Isabel was humiliated by your rejection. Either way, I do not believe her ambitions have been satisfied." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I will speak with my solicitor," he said finally. "If there is any way to uncover proof of her involvement in the scandal, any correspondence or witness willing to speak honestly about what happened that night, I want it found, not simply to protect us, but because she deserves to answer for what she has done." "Be careful," Margaret said. "A woman clever enough to orchestrate such a scheme without leaving evidence behind will not be easily caught." "I have underestimated her once already," Alaric said grimly. "I do not intend to make that mistake again." Their resolve, newly shared and newly strengthened by weeks of growing trust, gave Margaret a sense of quiet confidence she had not felt since the night everything had changed. Whatever Cordelia intended next, they would face it together, no longer as strangers bound by obligation, but as true partners bound by something far stronger. In the days that followed, Alaric's solicitor made quiet inquiries among the staff who had worked at the Ashcombe residence the night of the ball, searching for anyone who might have witnessed Cordelia's movements before the scandal unfolded. Progress was slow, careful, the kind of work that could not be rushed without risking exposure before enough evidence had been gathered. Margaret found herself both hopeful and anxious with each small report that reached them, aware that Cordelia was far too clever to have left an obvious trail behind her. In the meantime, life at Ashworth continued its gentle, hopeful rhythm. Margaret began to write letters to her brother Edmund, filled with details of her growing happiness that she knew would ease the worry that had lingered in his face since her wedding day. She described the gardens, the tenants she had come to know, and, carefully, without quite admitting the full depth of her feelings even to herself, the husband who had become far more than the cold stranger she had married under such difficult circumstances. Edmund's replies were warm with relief, though he cautioned her, gently, not to let her guard down entirely until Cordelia's role in the scandal had been fully exposed and answered for. Margaret took his warning to heart. Happiness, she had learned, could be fragile, especially when a woman as determined as Cordelia Whitmore remained free to scheme from the shadows of London society. That certainty, however, would soon be tested in ways neither of them fully anticipated. The letter that shattered their fragile peace arrived on a cold morning in early winter, delivered not to Margaret or Alaric directly, but circulated first through the whispering channels of London society. the way such things so often were, until it finally reached Ashworth in the form of a hastily written note from Margaret's aunt. Margaret read the note twice before the meaning fully settled into her chest like a stone. Someone had been telling stories. Stories that suggested the Duchess of Ashworth had been seen in private, intimate correspondence with a gentleman not her husband, correspondence that had somehow found its way into the hands of several prominent society hostesses who had wasted no time sharing its contents with anyone willing to listen. Her first instinct was disbelief, followed swiftly by a cold, creeping dread that settled into her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. She read the note a third time, searching for some detail that might explain the accusation, some misunderstanding that could be corrected with a simple conversation. But there was nothing simple about the words her aunt had written. The rumor had already taken hold, spreading through drawing rooms and card tables with the same terrible speed as wildfire through dry summer grass. "This is not possible," Margaret said, her hands trembling as she handed the note to Alaric across the breakfast table. "I have written no such letters. I do not even know the gentleman named in this account." Alaric's face darkened as he read, his jaw tightening with each line. "Lord Ashby," he said grimly, "I do not believe you have exchanged more than a handful of words with him at any gathering." "I have exchanged none at all," Margaret said. "I would remember if I had." "I believe you," Alaric said immediately, and something in the certainty of his voice, the absence of even a flicker of doubt, steadied Margaret's racing heart more than any reassurance could have. Months ago, she thought, he might have hesitated. He might have wondered, however briefly, whether the accusation held some grain of truth. Now, he simply believed her, without question, without conditions. "Cordelia," Margaret said, the name settling like ice in the room. "I have no proof," Alaric said, "but I share your suspicion entirely." Within hours, the full scope of the scandal became clear. Letters, forged with remarkable skill to resemble Margaret's own handwriting, had been circulated among several of London's most influential hostesses, containing intimate and damning language that painted Margaret as a woman engaged in a secret affair, mere months into her marriage. The forgeries were skillful enough that even Margaret, staring at samples her aunt had managed to obtain, felt a chill of unease at how closely they mimicked her own hand. "Whoever did this understood exactly how to imitate my writing," Margaret said, studying the pages with growing dread. "This was planned carefully, over time. Someone studied my correspondence closely enough to copy it convincingly." "Cordelia visited you," Alaric said slowly, realization dawning in his expression. "She would have had opportunity, during that visit, to see samples of your handwriting. A note left on your writing desk, a letter awaiting delivery." "I do not remember leaving anything within her view," Margaret said, trying to recall the details of that afternoon months ago, "but I cannot be entirely certain. She was in the sitting room for the better part of an hour." The accusation spread through London with the same devastating speed as the scandal that had first brought them together, and this time, Margaret found herself facing not merely whispered suspicion but active, cutting cruelty. Invitations that had begun, cautiously, to arrive at Ashworth in the weeks following their marriage now stopped entirely. A letter arrived from a distant cousin, curt and formal, severing what little connection remained between their families. Even Mrs. Fenwick, Margaret noticed with a sinking heart, seemed to regard her with renewed uncertainty, though she said nothing aloud. Margaret found herself, in quiet moments, questioning her own resolve. She had faced scandal once before, and survived it only through marriage to a man who had, at the time, believed the worst of her. Now, facing a fresh accusation with far more devastating implications, an accusation of infidelity rather than mere impropriety, she wondered whether even a marriage built on newfound trust could withstand society's relentless appetite for scandal. She said nothing of these doubts to Alaric, not wishing to burden him further, but they lingered nonetheless, quiet and persistent, in the sleepless hours of the night. It was Alaric himself who noticed her growing withdrawal, finding her one evening standing at her bedroom window, staring out at the dark gardens below rather than preparing for sleep. "You are troubled," he said, joining her at the window. "More troubled than you have let me see." "I fear," Margaret admitted quietly, "that even proof may not be enough. Society has already decided its story once. It may simply decide another, regardless of what truth we manage to uncover." Alaric turned her gently to face him, his hands warm on her shoulders. "Then we will give them no room for doubt," he said. "I did not fight for your reputation once, only to watch it crumble a second time, without doing everything within my power to defend it. Whatever it takes, Margaret, I intend to see this resolved, and resolved thoroughly." His certainty steadied her more than any words of comfort could have, and she found herself, for the first time since the note had arrived, believing that they might truly overcome this second scandal as they had overcome the first. "We must find proof," Margaret said one evening, pacing the length of the sitting room while Alaric watched from his chair, his own expression grim with barely contained anger. "Proof that the letters are forged, and proof, if we can find it, that Cordelia is responsible." "My solicitor has already begun examining the forgeries," Alaric said. "A skilled hand can often identify inconsistencies invisible to the untrained eye, small variations in pressure or spacing that reveal a forgery, however convincing it appears at first glance." It was Edmund, arriving unannounced at Ashworth 3 days later, travel-worn and grim-faced, who brought the breakthrough they so desperately needed. "I have been making inquiries in London," he said, settling into a chair in the sitting room while Margaret poured him tea with hands that shook slightly from days of accumulated worry. "A stationer near Bond Street recalled a woman matching Cordelia's description, purchasing paper and ink of a very particular quality, several weeks before the letters began circulating, the same quality of paper used in the forged correspondence." "That alone is not proof," Alaric said, though hope had entered his voice for the first time in days. "There is more," Edmund said. "The stationer's assistant, a young man eager enough for coin, remembered the woman requesting samples of several different inks, testing which produced the closest match to a sample she carried with her, a genuine letter she claimed belonged to a friend, whose hand she wished to imitate for a surprise correspondence." Edmund's expression hardened. "I have his signed statement, describing the woman in enough detail that there can be little doubt as to her identity." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, relief so profound it left her momentarily unable to speak. "This is enough," she said finally. "Surely this is enough to expose her." "It is a strong beginning," Alaric said. "But Cordelia is clever. She will deny everything, and a stationer's assistant's memory, however detailed, may not be enough to convince society entirely, not against the word of a woman with connections as extensive as hers." "Then we need more," Margaret said, determination hardening her resolve. "We need her to expose herself, publicly, where there can be no room for doubt or denial." A plan began to take shape over the following days, careful and deliberate, drawing on Alaric's connections within society, and Margaret's own quiet understanding of the woman they intended to expose. An invitation was arranged, seemingly innocent, to a small gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance, one Margaret knew Cordelia would find impossible to resist attending, eager as she surely was to witness the continued unraveling of Margaret's reputation. The evening of the gathering arrived cold and clear, the townhouse where the event was held glittering with candlelight as London's most influential families gathered for an evening of cards and conversation. Margaret felt her heart pounding as she entered on Alaric's arm, aware of every whispered comment, every sideways glance directed her way, but she held her head high, determined not to let the accumulated weight of scandal break her composure before the evening's true purpose could unfold. She had chosen her gown carefully that evening, a deep sapphire blue that Alaric had once remarked suited her particularly well, a small act of quiet confidence in a night that demanded every ounce of courage she could summon. Edmund walked a short distance behind them, his expression carefully neutral, playing his part in the plan they had rehearsed together the night before with the precision of a man determined not to fail his sister a second time. The room fell into hushed murmurs as they entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence as heads turned to observe the disgraced Duchess and her husband. Margaret forced herself to smile politely at those who greeted her, though she could feel the weight of countless speculative glances following her every movement across the room. Cordelia arrived fashionably late, resplendent in deep green silk, and made her way through the room with practiced grace, accepting condolences and sympathetic glances from those who believed her merely a concerned friend of the disgraced Duchess. Margaret watched her carefully from across the room, waiting for the right moment. It came when Edmund, following the plan they had carefully arranged, approached Cordelia with careful casualness, engaging her in conversation about handwriting and correspondence, a topic chosen deliberately to test her composure. He mentioned, as though merely making conversation, the stationer near Bond Street, praising the quality of a particular ink he had recently discovered there. Margaret watched from a short distance, her heart pounding, as something flickered across Cordelia's face, brief but unmistakable, a flash of alarm quickly smoothed away behind practiced calm. It was not enough, not on its own, to convict her before the gathered company, but it was enough to confirm what Margaret had already known in her heart. The true confrontation came moments later, when Alaric, following their careful plan, produced the stationer's signed statement before a small but influential group of witnesses, explaining calmly and clearly the evidence that had been gathered regarding the forged correspondence. The stationer's assistant provided a detailed description, Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, drawing the attention of nearby guests who quickly fell silent, sensing the importance of the moment. A woman matching that description in every particular purchased paper and ink, identical to that used in the letters circulated against my wife, and requested specifically to test which ink most closely matched a sample of the Duchess's own handwriting. Cordelia's composure finally cracked, color draining from her face as every eye in the room turned toward her. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharper than she perhaps intended, betraying the panic beneath her words. "I have never set foot in such an establishment." "The assistant described your gown in detail," Edmund said quietly, stepping forward. "The very gown you wear this evening, as it happens, deep green, with silver embroidery at the sleeves. He remembered it particularly, as few women commission such distinctive work." A murmur swept through the gathered guests, understanding beginning to dawn across their faces as they looked between Cordelia's stricken expression and the confident, unified front presented by Alaric and Margaret standing together. "You have hated my husband for years," Margaret said, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Ever since he ended his engagement to your dearest friend, you could not forgive him for it, and when scandal placed me in his path, you saw an opportunity to destroy what should never have belonged to me, believing perhaps that if you could not have him, no one deserving of happiness should." "You know nothing," Cordelia hissed, her carefully cultivated composure entirely abandoned now, replaced by raw, undisguised fury. "I know enough," Margaret said. "I know you orchestrated the scandal that forced our marriage in the first place. I know you visited me under false pretenses of friendship, studying my handwriting for exactly this purpose, and I believe, given time, we will find proof enough of the first scheme as thoroughly as we have found proof of the second." The room had gone utterly silent, every guest transfixed by the unfolding confrontation, and Cordelia, finding herself surrounded by disbelieving stares and the unshakable evidence Alaric had presented, seemed to visibly deflate, whatever remained of her composure crumbling entirely. "You will regret this," she said, though the threat carried little weight, spoken as it was to a room full of witnesses who had just watched her scheme exposed in full. "I regret only that it took so long to uncover the truth," Alaric said, his voice cold and final. "You will find yourself unwelcome in any home that values honesty, Lady Whitmore. I intend to see that every household in London understands exactly what you have done." Cordelia fled the gathering shortly after, her reputation shattered as thoroughly as she had once tried to shatter Margaret's, and the guests who remained turned toward Margaret with expressions that had shifted, almost instantly, from suspicion to sympathy, and in some cases, genuine admiration for the composure she had shown throughout the ordeal. By the following morning, the story had spread through London exactly as the original scandal had, but this time, Margaret found herself cast not as the woman who had trapped a duke through scheming, but as the wronged and dignified Duchess who had faced her accuser with grace and emerged entirely vindicated. Alaric found her in the garden that afternoon, standing near the same fountain where their fragile trust had first begun to grow months before. He crossed the distance between them without hesitation, taking both her hands in his. "You were remarkable last night," he said, "as you have been remarkable in every difficulty this marriage has placed before you." "We faced it together," Margaret said. "That is what made the difference." "Yes," Alaric said softly, "it is." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Margaret, I do not believe I have ever trusted another person as completely as I trust you. Not before Isabel's betrayal taught me caution, and certainly not since. You are the only woman who has ever earned that trust honestly, through nothing but your own honesty and courage." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes, though they were tears of relief and happiness rather than sorrow. "And you," she said, "are the only man who has ever made me feel that trust was worth the risk of giving." "What happens now?" Margaret asked softly, for Cordelia. "Society will handle her far more thoroughly than any court of law could," Alaric said. "She will find every door in London closed to her, every invitation withdrawn. It is perhaps a fitting consequence for a woman who built her entire scheme on the destruction of another's reputation." Margaret considered this for a moment, feeling not triumph exactly, but a quiet sense of justice finally realized. "I do not wish her harm," she said. "Only the truth, finally, spoken plainly enough that no one can doubt it again." "You have always wanted only the truth," Alaric said, studying her with open admiration. It is one of the many things I have come to love about you." The word hung between them, gentle and unmistakable, and Margaret felt her breath catch entirely. "You love me," she said, not quite a question, though she needed to hear it confirmed all the same. "I do," Alaric said, his voice steady and certain in a way she had never heard from him before, not even in their most intimate conversations. "I did not expect to, when this marriage began. I did not believe myself capable of it, after everything Isabel taught me to fear. But you have shown me, every single day since our wedding, exactly what honest devotion looks like, and I find myself entirely, hopelessly in love with you, Margaret." Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, warm despite the winter chill settling over the gardens. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time now, though I confess I was too frightened to say so, uncertain whether you might ever feel the same." He drew her close then, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that felt entirely different from the careful distance of their earliest days together, and Margaret rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, finally certain of the life they were building together. They stood together by the fountain as the winter sun began to set behind the estate, the scandal that had once threatened to destroy them now entirely unraveled, and the marriage that had begun in obligation and suspicion transformed, slowly and completely, into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Winter settled fully over Ashworth in the weeks that followed, blanketing the gardens in soft white snow and turning the great stone house into something out of a storybook, warm firelight glowing behind frosted windows while the world outside slept beneath its quiet cover. Cordelia Whitmore, as Alaric had predicted, found herself entirely cast out from the society she had once moved through with such confident ease. Invitations dried up entirely. Doors that had once welcomed her closed firmly against further visits, and within a month of the confrontation, word reached Ashworth that she had retreated to a distant relative's estate in the north, her reputation too thoroughly ruined to salvage within London itself. Margaret felt no satisfaction in the news, only a quiet relief that the threat hanging over her marriage had finally, truly passed. Margaret's aunt wrote occasionally with news from London, small updates on Cordelia's continued disgrace that Margaret read with a strange, quiet detachment. She had expected, in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, to feel something closer to triumph, but instead she found only relief, and a growing determination to leave the entire episode behind her rather than dwell upon it. Whatever satisfaction there was to be found in Cordelia's downfall, Margaret preferred to find it in her own happiness rather than in another woman's ruin. Edmund visited often that winter, his earlier anger and protectiveness settling into genuine affection for the brother-in-law he had once regarded with deep suspicion. He and Alaric spent long evenings discussing estate matters and, increasingly, simply enjoying one another's company over cards or quiet conversation by the fire, and Margaret found herself deeply grateful to watch the two most important men in her life build a genuine friendship rather than merely tolerating one another for her sake. With Cordelia's schemes fully unraveled and the scandal that had once threatened to destroy them entirely reversed in Margaret's favor, life at Ashworth settled into something Margaret had never quite dared to imagine for herself. Genuine, unguarded happiness. Alaric no longer maintained even the smallest distance between them. He sought her company freely, whether in the quiet hours after dinner or during long walks through the frozen gardens, bundled against the cold, his hand always finding hers as though he could not quite bear to walk beside her without touching her in some small way. The household had transformed alongside their marriage, the servants no longer whispering behind closed doors but genuinely fond of their Duchess, whose kindness and courage had earned their respect far more thoroughly than any title ever could have. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the sitting-room windows, Alaric surprised Margaret with a small velvet box, presented, not with the formal correctness of their wedding day, but with something closer to genuine nervousness, an emotion she had rarely seen from her composed, controlled husband. "I know we are already married," he said, "and I know the manner of our wedding gave you little choice in the matter, and even less romance. But I find I want to ask you properly, now that you know the whole of my heart, whether you would choose me again, freely, if given the chance." Margaret opened the box to find a ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the grand jewels she might have expected from a duke, but chosen, she understood instantly, with careful thought toward her own quiet preferences rather than mere display of wealth. "Alaric," she said, her voice catching with emotion, "you already have my whole heart. You do not need to ask twice for something you have already earned entirely." "Then say yes," he said, "not because circumstance demanded it, but because you choose it, freely and completely, exactly as I choose you." "Yes," Margaret said, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, entirely and completely. I choose you." He slid the ring onto her finger alongside the one he had given her on their wedding day, and this time, when he kissed her, there was nothing formal or restrained in it, only warmth and certainty and a love that had grown slowly, honestly, from the coldest of beginnings into something neither of them had ever expected to find. They chose to renew their vows in a small, private ceremony held in the estate's chapel that same winter, attended only by Edmund, Margaret's aunt, and a handful of servants who had become, over the months, something closer to family than mere household staff. There were no curious crowds this time, no whispered scandal hanging over the proceedings, only genuine joy shared among people who had watched Margaret and Elric's marriage transform from cold obligation into something worth celebrating properly. Margaret wore a gown of pale gold silk, chosen this time not out of necessity but out of genuine anticipation, and when she walked down the short aisle of the small chapel toward Alaric, she felt none of the numb resignation that had marked their first wedding day. Instead, she felt only anticipation, warm and certain, for the life they were choosing together, this time with full and open hearts. "I take you, Margaret," Alaric said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Not because scandal demanded it, but because I have come to love you more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone. You are my partner, my equal, and the only woman I have ever fully trusted with my whole heart." "I take you, Alaric," Margaret replied, her own voice thick with happiness. "Not out of obligation, but out of genuine love, freely given and freely returned. You have shown me that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt into something stronger than it ever was before, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the trust you have placed in me." The small gathering erupted into warm applause as they sealed their renewed vows with a kiss, and even Mrs. Fenwick, watching from near the chapel doors, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her earlier suspicion of the new Duchess replaced entirely by genuine affection. Margaret's aunt embraced her tightly afterward, tears standing bright in her eyes. "I worried so terribly for you, that first dreadful morning," she admitted quietly. "I feared you had been condemned to a life of cold duty, nothing more. I am so very glad to have been wrong." "I feared the same," Margaret admitted, glancing toward Alaric, who stood nearby, speaking warmly with Edmund. "But I have learned that even the coldest beginnings can grow into something warm, given enough patience and enough courage to be honest with one another." The chapel bells rang softly as they finally stepped out into the crisp winter air, snow crunching beneath their feet as the small wedding party made their way back toward the main house, laughter and warm conversation carrying across the quiet grounds in a way that would have seemed impossible only months before. The celebration that followed was small but joyful, held in the estate's great hall decorated simply with winter greenery and candlelight, far removed from the grand, cold formality that had marked their first wedding. Edmund raised a toast to his sister's happiness, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of watching her navigate scandal and uncertainty with more grace and courage than he had believed anyone capable of, and Margaret found herself surrounded, for the first time since arriving at Ashworth, by genuine warmth and celebration rather than cautious formality. The servants had prepared a modest feast for the occasion, far simpler than the grand banquets typically associated with a duke's household, but rich with warmth and genuine care that no amount of formal grandeur could have matched. Mrs. Fenwick herself had overseen the preparation of a particular honey cake that Margaret had once mentioned, in passing, as a favorite from her childhood, and the gesture brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes when she realized the housekeeper had remembered and acted upon such a small, casual comment. "You did not need to go to such trouble," Margaret said, finding Mrs. Fenwick near the kitchen doorway later that evening. "It was no trouble at all, Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said, her earlier coolness entirely replaced by genuine warmth. "We are all of us glad to see you and His Grace so happy. This house has not felt so alive in many years, not since the old Duke passed." Margaret found herself unexpectedly moved by the housekeeper's words, understanding fully, for the first time, just how completely she had earned her place within this household, not through her title alone, but through months of quiet kindness and genuine effort. Later that evening, as the small gathering finally began to disperse and the great hall grew quiet once more, Alaric drew Margaret aside, leading her toward the same gardens where so much of their story had unfolded, now blanketed in soft winter snow that glittered beneath the moonlight. "Do you remember," he said, "the first time we sat together on this bench, when I still could not bring myself to speak openly of my past?" "I remember," Margaret said, smiling at the memory of that careful, tentative conversation, so different from the openness they now shared. "You told me perhaps another evening you would tell me the truth of your history, I did not expect it would take quite so many evenings to arrive. Some truths take time to trust another person with, Alaric said, but you have never once given me reason to regret trusting you. Not with my past, not with my heart, not with anything I have shared. Margaret leaned against him, watching their breath fog gently in the cold winter air. And you have never given me reason to regret marrying you, she said, even under such difficult circumstances. I do not think I could have imagined, that first terrible night at the ball, that scandal would lead me to a love as complete as this. Nor could I, Alaric admitted. I expected only obligation, duty, perhaps eventual civility if we were fortunate. I never expected to find in you the one person I could trust entirely, without reservation, without fear of betrayal. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching snow drift softly down over the quiet gardens, and Margaret felt, more certainly than she had ever felt anything before, that whatever difficulties life might still bring their way, they would face them together, as true partners bound not by scandal or obligation, but by genuine, hard-won love. In the weeks that followed their renewed vows, life at Ashworth settled into a warm, contented rhythm entirely different from the cautious formality of their early marriage. Alaric continued to seek Margaret's counsel on matters concerning the estate and its tenants, valuing her insight as much as his own careful management of numbers and ledgers. Margaret, in turn, found herself increasingly confident in her role as Duchess, no longer the quiet, overlooked woman who had once faded into the corners of ballrooms, but a respected figure within her own household, and, gradually, within London society as well. Invitations began arriving once more as spring approached, this time extended with genuine warmth rather than cautious curiosity, and when Margaret and Alaric finally returned to London for the first time since their scandal had unfolded, they were greeted not with whispered suspicion but with genuine welcome, their love story having become, in the months since Cordelia's exposure, something of a celebrated tale among the very society that had once condemned Margaret so swiftly and so unfairly. The very first evening of their return, an invitation arrived from the same family who had hosted the ball where their story had first begun, extended this time with warm sincerity rather than mere social obligation. Margaret hesitated when the invitation arrived, old memories of that chaotic, humiliating night rising unexpectedly to the surface. "We do not have to attend," Alaric said gently, noticing her hesitation. "There will be other occasions, if this one feels too difficult." Margaret considered his words for a long moment, then shook her head, a new resolve settling over her. "No," she said. "I think perhaps it is exactly the right place to return to. I do not wish to spend the rest of my life avoiding the very room where this whole difficult, unexpected journey began. I would rather walk into it now, as your wife, secure and happy, and reclaim what that night once tried to take from me." Alaric's expression softened with quiet pride. "Then we shall attend," he said, "together." The evening of the ball arrived clear and mild, the first true hint of spring warming the London air, and as their carriage pulled up outside the familiar townhouse, Margaret felt none of the dread she might have expected. Instead, she felt only a quiet, steady confidence, born of months spent proving to herself, and to the husband beside her, exactly what she was capable of. Standing together at a grand ball much like the one where their story had first begun, Margaret found herself remembering the terrified, humiliated young woman who had been pulled behind a curtain into scandal months before, and marveling at how far she had traveled since that frightening night. She was no longer that frightened woman, uncertain of her place in a world that had judged her so harshly. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, secure in her husband's love, respected within her own household, and entirely, completely herself. Several of the same guests who had once watched her humiliation unfold now approached her with warm smiles and genuine compliments, some even offering quiet apologies for their earlier readiness to believe the worst of her. Margaret accepted each gesture with grace, understanding that society's opinion, however painful it had once been to endure, mattered far less to her now than the steady, unwavering love she had found within her own marriage. Alaric found her gaze across the crowded ballroom and crossed to her side, offering his arm with a smile that held none of the guarded formality of their earliest days together. "Shall we dance?" he asked. "It seems only fitting, given where our story began." Margaret took his arm, laughing softly at the memory of that chaotic night, so different now in retrospect, colored not by fear, but by gratitude for the unexpected path it had set them upon. "Yes," she said, "let us dance." They moved together across the ballroom floor, past the very same alcove where a hand had once pulled her into scandal, and this time, rather than fear, Margaret felt only a quiet, triumphant peace. The room that had once witnessed her deepest humiliation now witnessed instead the easy, genuine happiness of a marriage that had survived every attempt to destroy it, emerging stronger and more certain with each trial it had faced. As the dance drew to its close, Alaric drew her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I love you," he said simply, "more than I ever believed myself capable of loving another person. Thank you for choosing to trust me, even when I gave you every reason not to." "I love you too," Margaret replied, her heart full to overflowing. "And I would choose you again, every single time, regardless of how our story began." Whatever challenges the future might bring, Margaret knew now, with a certainty that settled deep and warm within her heart, that she would face them beside a man who trusted her completely, loved her entirely, and considered her, above all else, the one woman in all the world he could always rely upon. 3 years passed at Ashworth, each season folding gently into the next, and the great stone house that had once felt so cold and unfamiliar to Margaret had long since become simply home, filled now with warmth, laughter, and the quiet contentment of a marriage built on genuine trust. The portraits that once seemed to watch her with silent judgment now felt instead like quiet companions, familiar faces she passed each morning on her way to the nursery, no longer strangers but part of the fabric of the life she had built within these walls. She had learned every creak of the old floorboards, every corner of the sprawling gardens, every servant's name and small preference, until the house that had once felt vast and unfamiliar had become, thread by careful thread, entirely her own. On a bright morning in early summer, Margaret stood at the nursery window, watching sunlight spill across the gardens below, where her husband walked hand in hand with their daughter, a curious, bright-eyed girl of 2 years who had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's steady, watchful eyes. Little Rose toddled beside Alaric with the fierce determination of a child convinced she could keep pace with a grown man's stride, and Margaret smiled, watching him slow his steps patiently to match hers, exactly as he had once matched his pace to Margaret's own during their earliest morning walks together. She rested a gentle hand against her own middle, where new life had begun to grow only weeks before, a secret she had not yet shared even with Alaric, wanting to hold the quiet joy of it a little longer, before the household inevitably filled with excitement and preparation. She intended to tell him that very evening, after Rose had been put to bed and they could share the news privately, just the two of them, as they had shared so many important moments over the years. The estate itself had flourished under their combined stewardship. Alaric continued to manage its finances and formal affairs with the same careful precision he had always brought to his duties, but he no longer did so alone. Margaret had become, over the years, an equal partner in every meaningful decision, her insight into the tenants and their needs proving invaluable time and again, earning her a respect among the estate's people that rivaled even her husband's. The tenant family whose cottage had once burned, the very fire that had first shown Margaret's true courage to her husband, had long since rebuilt, their gratitude toward the Duchess never fading even as the years passed. Their eldest daughter, now a young woman, had taken a position within the main house as one of Margaret's personal attendants, a role she filled with evident pride and genuine affection for the mistress who had once run into flames for the sake of her family's beloved cat. The cat itself, grown fat and comfortable in its old age, had become something of a permanent fixture in the nursery, curling contentedly beside Rose during her afternoon naps as though it understood, in whatever quiet way animals understand such things, exactly whose courage had once saved its life. Edmund visited often, no longer merely as a protective brother anxious for his sister's welfare, but as a genuine friend to Alaric, the two men having built a bond over years of shared holidays, hunting excursions, and long evenings of conversation that Margaret treasured watching unfold. Edmund had married 2 years prior, a quiet, kind woman he had met through Alaric's connections, and their own growing family often visited Ashworth, filling its halls with the joyful chaos of children's laughter that the old house had not known in generations. Margaret's aunt, too, remained a frequent and beloved visitor, delighting in her role as Rose's doting great-aunt, spoiling the child with small treats and stories of Margaret's own childhood that never failed to make Alaric laugh at the thought of his composed, dignified wife once climbing trees and chasing chickens through her family's modest garden. Cordelia Whitmore's name rarely arose in conversation anymore, her disgrace having faded into a distant memory rather than a lingering threat. Margaret's aunt had written, some months after the scandal fully settled, that Cordelia had eventually married a minor gentleman of modest fortune in the north. Margaret felt, upon hearing the news, only a distant, quiet peace. entirely free of the anxiety and suspicion that had once colored every mention of the woman's name. That evening, after Rose had been tucked into bed with her favorite story, read twice through at her insistent request, Margaret found Alaric in his study, reviewing a report from the estate steward by candlelight. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening immediately, as it always did, at the simple sight of her. "You look pleased with yourself," he observed, setting aside his papers entirely. "What secret are you keeping from me, Margaret?" She had never been able to hide anything from him for long, not since the earliest days of their marriage when honesty had become the foundation upon which everything else had been built. She crossed the room and settled into the chair across from his desk, unable to suppress her smile any longer. "We are to have another child," she said softly. "Come winter, I believe." Alaric's face transformed entirely, joy breaking across his features with such open, unguarded delight that Margaret felt her own heart swell with happiness at the sight of it. He rose immediately and came around the desk, kneeling beside her chair and taking both her hands in his. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you continue to give me more happiness than I ever believed myself capable of receiving. Another child. Rose will be delighted to have a brother or sister to look after. Or to boss about entirely, more likely," Margaret said, laughing through happy tears. "She has inherited your stubbornness, I fear, alongside your dark hair." "She has inherited your kindness as well," Alaric said, pressing a gentle kiss to Margaret's forehead. "And your courage. I have watched her march into the stables entirely unafraid of horses twice her size, exactly as her mother once marched into a burning building for the sake of a frightened cat." Margaret laughed again, the memory of that terrifying afternoon now softened by years of happiness into something she could recall with fondness rather than fear. "I hope this child inherits rather more caution than either of us managed to demonstrate," she said, "though I suspect we may be disappointed on that front." "Perhaps a scholar this time," Alaric mused, still kneeling beside her, clearly reluctant to let go of her hands. "Someone content to spend their days among books rather than racing toward every open stable door in sight." "Now that," Margaret said, "would be a welcome change indeed, though I would not wager heavily upon it, given the parents responsible for producing this child." He laughed, the sound warm and unguarded, so different from the careful, measured man she had first married, beneath such difficult circumstances. She never tired of hearing that laugh, of watching the ease with which happiness now moved across his features, a man entirely transformed from the guarded stranger who had once stood so stiffly in her family's sitting room, offering marriage as though it were merely a transaction to be settled. They sat together for a long while that evening, discussing names, hopes, and small dreams for the child yet to come, the conversation flowing as easily between them as it always did now, years removed from the careful, guarded formality that had once defined their earliest days together. Later, as they prepared for bed, Alaric paused at the window, looking out over the moonlit gardens below, the same gardens where so much of their story had unfolded, from careful early conversations, to a renewed proposal, to countless quiet moments of growing trust and love. "Do you ever think of that first night?" he asked, "the scandal that brought us together in such an unexpected way?" "Often," Margaret admitted, joining him at the window, "though I no longer think of it with fear or regret. I think of it, instead, as the beginning of everything I now treasure most in this world. Without that terrible night, I would never have known you, never have discovered the man beneath your careful guard, never have built this life we now share." "I used to believe scandal had ruined my chance at genuine happiness," Alaric said, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders. "Instead, it gave me the one person I could trust more completely than I ever believed possible. You transformed what should have been a disaster into the greatest gift of my life. And you transformed what should have been a lonely, dutiful marriage into a genuine partnership," Margaret said. "I arrived at this house a frightened, overlooked young woman, uncertain of my place in the world. You gave me the chance to discover exactly who I could become, given patience and trust and the freedom to be entirely myself." "You would have discovered it regardless," Alaric said softly. "I merely had the good fortune to witness it happen. Your courage, your kindness, your quiet strength, none of that was my doing. It was always within you, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal itself fully." Margaret leaned into him, watching moonlight play across the familiar gardens below, grateful beyond measure for the unlikely path that had led her here, to this life, this love, this quiet, steady happiness she had once believed impossible, for a woman overlooked and unremarkable, pulled by chance into a scandal that had ultimately given her everything she had never known to hope for. "Whatever challenges still lie ahead," she said softly, I know now that we will face them together, exactly as we have faced everything since that first difficult night. Together, Alaric agreed, drawing her closer. Always together. Outside, the gardens lay quiet beneath the summer moon, the fountain where their trust had first begun to grow, glinting softly in the silver light, silent witness to a love story that had begun in scandal, and grown, slowly and completely, into something neither of them had ever dared to imagine for themselves. A duke who had once trusted no one, and a quiet, overlooked woman the world had nearly forgotten, had built together a life richer and more genuine than either had believed possible, proving that even the coldest beginnings could grow, given patience and honesty and courage, into the warmest and most enduring of loves.